Beckmann, like so many others, will rationalize the war. In fact, he will be in favor of going to war. And this is not unusual. We see huge rallies in August of 1914 in Munich, Paris, London, Berlin, and elsewhere. And here we have hundreds of thousands, or sometimes maybe even millions of people rallying together, wanting to go to war. At the time, they see it as sport. They see it through the lens of social Darwinism. Let's find out which nations really are healthy and which ones are not, so we can carve up the ones that are not amongst the ones that are. And they thought that this would be a 6-week war, something where the men would be home in time for Christmas. And of course, now we know that that's not the case. And Beckmann really plays into that. He is in favor of the war early on, but he will become quite disillusioned with the idea of the war as it draws forth. And he will create Night. And I should say that this is a particularly violent image. So just a heads up on that. Now, the violence and retching brutality invade the home and comment on the social condition. The home is symbolized by the interior. So let's start by looking at the piece and dissecting what you see, because the entire piece is about the effect of war on the home. And keep in mind, in World War I, we don't see a lot of civilian bombardment, so the home is thought to be quite separate from what's going on in the war. But we're going to see that that is far from the case. Remember, this is new objectivity. They're going to be as honest and brutal about it as possible. So let's start out with the characters. Here we see the husband. He's on the table. The wife is tied up here. Everyone else is an invading force, effectively. And as we move along, the husband is at home. He can generally be expected to be a soldier who is somehow injured. How do we know he's a soldier? Look at his foot. This black foot is reminiscent of trench foot, a rather constant ailment that they go through, where if your feet are wet for months at a time, as they would be in the trenches, they literally start to rot on your body. Big issue there. We see he's being assaulted by the head, in this case almost hung, and that may imply that he's also suffering from shell shock and being forced back into the war. We also see a woman in red. What do you know about a woman in red? Well, a woman in red in art generally indicates a prostitute. So, why is there a prostitute in the home? Well, one of the most common ways to get out of the war on both sides was to go and see a prostitute who would advertise, and we have pictures of this in Paris and elsewhere, would hang out a shingle or basically advertise that, yes, I have an STD. The idea was you go to her, you get the STD, and then you get to go home and recuperate. They would always send soldiers home who have STDs because they couldn't really treat them in the trenches. It caused too much problem, so you send them home, which means I get to go home for 8 weeks, maybe 3 months, and at least that's time that I'm not dying. Now, you may say, well, that's really immoral, it's unfair to the wife, but put yourself in the shoes of the wife. Would you rather that your husband come home in a casket or with an STD that can be treated, especially if he's doing it specifically to get home in the first place? These are the gray areas of morality that we tend to see in times of war. Moving on, we have this guy. Between the vest and the pipe, we can imagine that he's some form of doctor, literally twisting the man's arm, meaning that he's basically declaring him fit for active service, an idea that we've already seen in the past, but it's going to get worse. So as we move forward, we have an image of brutality. Of course, brutality always plays a role in wartime, and brutality here can be the physical brutality of enemy soldiers or the physical brutality that we see the husband going through, but also refers to, at times, the black market and the kinds of brutality that you go through on the civilian side when everyone's starving. Of course, bringing a woman along with him, almost as if threatening to replace the wife with this female figure. But then the wife, you'll notice she's not wearing pants, she's wearing an apron, there's a candlestick. It gives us a sense of sexual assault. And in terms of history around World War I, what we see a lot of is basically pragmatic prostitution. The idea that you're going to say, hey, I don't have enough money to pay for that extra food on the black market. So what am I going to offer? Well, I'll offer my body. And is that a moral idea? I mean, you've already got the husband potentially cheating to get an STD and come home. The wife is now cheating, but she's doing it so that she can feed the children. So is it really cheating in the first place? Lots of very difficult things. And you can imagine how both of these sexual interactions, either with the prostitute or with the black marketeer, is going to cause stresses and problems in the relationship. Even though they're pragmatic, they're necessary to survival, they're obviously going to cause a lot of issue. We have this massive sound horn in the center. Of course, the sounds of war. We have veterans that talk about this, being haunted by the sounds of war, but also just the general noisiness. And it actually goes even further, because there's actually, when you look in the back here, there seems to be a little bit of a reflection. And you go, well, what's that a reflection of? It doesn't matter what it is. You'll notice it's in the form of an upside down cross. But the cross is negative space, as if the cross is intentionally removed. Religion does not serve its normal functioning purpose in a time of war. There's no one to really look up to. There's only surviving from day to day. So what we have is a particularly bleak and difficult image that's being laid out by Beckmann. How war is shattering the domestic tranquility that we usually expect in the home. All of the privacy has been taken away through depictions of rape and suffering. The only perceived safety in the once perceived safety of the home. Objects throughout are dislocated and the space is buckled, jagged, and illogical to get across the idea of a sudden trauma. Trauma, of course, being remembered in fragments. Think about a time when you've gone through a trauma. It could be anything from childhood trauma to a car accident. You never remember it as a narrative, and here we get a visual sense of that because he has broken it up, used cubist ideas in the background. We have these very unusual planes and everything else, giving us that jagged feeling of the recollection of trauma, which is exactly what Beckmann's trying to get across, bring out of his viewer. The angularity of the figures and the rough surface contribute to this image's incredible savageness. And yet, if he wasn't savage with it, you could imagine the Germans 20, 30, 40 years down the line, let's imagine that we don't know World War II is coming yet, going, well, it wasn't really that bad, it toughened us up. Rather than looking back and going, my God, this was horrific. The idea of the war and what it did to us, what it did to Dad, what it did to Mom, what it did to the family, and all of that being passed down generation to generation, having an impact 2, 3, 4 generations down the line. This is about the horrors of war. Very Rubenesque idea. He's just making it really personal.